Howdy, everybody. Chess College is Tuesday, the 10th. Humanities 2. Hope everything's going well with you. Hope you're all busily working on your papers on the subject of Martin Luther. And no, it's not Martin Luther King. I know a lot of you probably thought it was, but it isn't. An important religious figure that went up against a very, very powerful Catholic Church and changed everything. I'm not in my usual place right now. I'm traveling. I'm in Portland at a friend's house, so it's a little different background and stuff. He used to be in a band with me, fellow filmmaker from years ago. Anyway, the weather here is lovely, 68 degrees, cloudy, not like when I left for Reading. It's going to be tomorrow. They say 109, 111 degrees. Not going to be pleasant. I got some weird sun coming in on me here. It's not making me happy. Let's see if I can get rid of it. Maybe that'll help. Yeah, that helps. Anyway, keep plowing through. I'm going to look at, when you can, look at the announcements. I'll be putting samples up there of what your journal should look like. Make sure you keep up on the journals, the reflective journals. It's important. If you get behind, you're going to forget what we covered during that week, and that's not good. So I would write your notes, enter them in, because you will have to type them and upload them as an assignment, but not to the very last week of school. Okay, and then you'll have your first essay going to be due here in a couple days. Have patience on me grading that. I do. I'll grade them as fast as I can and make comments. If I don't make a comment, it means you did it all right. Anyway, hope you got something out of the Martin Luther documentary. Hope it wasn't too boring. Hope you learned something about who we are as human beings and how it all is connecting together. That's what I'm trying to do in this class. Connect what happened 500 years ago and how important that is. You have to know your history of these social changes, cultural changes, to understand where we are now in our history and now in our culture. Think about that. What's going on in our culture now? Right? We're in the midst of the ending, hopefully, of this pandemic. That's a cultural shift that we'll be talking about, writing about for years. Where the West is in the throes of another major drought. The fire season is looming. The politics have changed. Republicans and Democrats hardly could speak to each other. Things have changed. That's what's going on in the culture. And so what was going on in the culture 500 years ago that started the trajectory to where we are today started in a very important place in the north of Italy called Florence. Maybe you've heard of it, Florence, Italy. It's in the Tuscany area of Italy, and it is essentially the birthplace of the Renaissance. The Renaissance is essentially things changed and they blossomed. What was happening? World travel was starting. There was traders coming in with goods and services from all around the world, and people were for the first time able to buy stuff and afford this stuff and pass it on to others. And so there was a great upshift in the economy, which is important because when you have money to spend, things change. And a thing that helped change things was also the fact that Florence is the first essentially important city that started a sewage system. I know that sounds like, oh, what, wow. but it was important. How to get the human waste product out of the city, away from people. And once they figured it out with this very sophisticated system of pipe going through the city and going into the rivers, of course, and out to the ocean to help pollute the ocean. But it took years to do that. But at least it's getting the human waste away from where people are living, where they're having to eat and drink and live. And when that left, a lot of illnesses that were born from living in your own in our own human waste product uh, led to early death, lots of sicknesses, hepatitis, whatever that they had no medication for. Once the sewage system started taking the waste out to the ocean and away from people, people became healthier, and that gave people hope. And then there's an influx of some money because trade is happening around the world, and people are getting to be able to buy things and purchase things and to sell things. And so that's going to create an upswing in art, music, the things that make us culturally rich as human beings. That's what gives us our humanity. It's when we have those things. And one of the greatest artists in the history of art, Michelangelo, was centered in Florence. Maybe you've heard of him. When I cover art in more detail, you'll probably have to watch documentaries about him or write about him. I'm not sure yet. But he is famous for being a great sculptor. Maybe seen some of his art, maybe seen it in documentaries and movies. Maybe you've been to Rome, maybe you've been to Florence, and you know what I'm talking about. But he's famous for his drawings, the Sistine Chapel, where he drew on the ceiling. The Pope gave him the job, and he drew. You've seen the famous photograph, painting that he did of God reaching down to human, and he thrived during the Renaissance. That had what they weren't calling it that then. That was named that later. And so now the art world is starting to get thrive, and that starts permeating throughout Europe. Now, I'm not talking. We're not talking about America yet. This is still too young. America is just getting settled, so nothing of importance really, besides trying to survive, is happening in America. We're talking. We're in the 1400 to 1500s here, so that's where we are when it comes to history. So at the same time, we have Michelangelo creating these great works of art. We've got writers I mentioned earlier in different countries, like Cervantes writing um, Don Quixote, which is a seminal modern novel. And then we have in England, we have William Shakespeare starting to write his incredible works that changed the world. That's why I had you guys talk about Shakespeare and the discussion. How do you know Shakespeare? And a lot of you have seen, because I've been reading your discussions. You start with Romeo and Juliet, which is pretty basic because they teach that to high schoolers mostly. But he also did King Lear, Hamlet, Macbeth, Julius Caesar, and 30, 40 other important works of art besides the well known Romeo and Juliet. We are still saying his phrases to this day. They've become a part of the lexicon of our language, and sometimes we don't even know where it came from. And if you go back to Hamlet or Macbeth, you'll go, oh, I know that saying, I know that phrase. I'm going to talk more about Shakespeare later on this week, not today, and get into it more in depth. But he's so prevalent in our modern language 500 years after his death, that we take it for granted, and we say phrases and things that Shakespeare created for his plays, and most people don't know what's coming from Shakespeare. That's how common it is in the language, the vernacular. So that's happening in Europe is starting to thrive. This is Western Europe now, folks, that we're talking about mostly. Um, the architecture starts changing. Architecture is a big deal. We live in buildings, they're important to us. We're going to do a whole week on, or 2 days, or 3 days on architecture. How important is architecture to who we are as human beings? Well, it's really important. Think about the house you live in, or the apartment you live in, or the tent you live in, or the trailer you live in, or the van you live in, or the cities you visit, the hotels you stay in, the museums you go to, the movie theaters, the nightclubs, the grocery stores, Trader Joe's, whatever. Those are buildings that we're all in now. Right now, the architecture's rather dull and boring. Square box that we all go into, and we don't even look at the architecture. What are we supposed to look at when we go into, say, a supermarket? Does it have meaning? Does the building itself has meaning, or is it what's inside the building that is the has the meaning? But there was one time in the history of mankind where the building itself gave meaning to who we are as humans, not what's in the building. And so, too, because most of the famous elaborate buildings that were changed by through architecture were places of worship, usually Catholic churches. And so that's what's happening inside these buildings. And so to make people want to come into the building, not just to get some religion or faith, whatever they're looking for when they come into the building, what does the building represent? They designed buildings to represent what was going on inside the building. I mean, I don't know if anybody uh, was has been to Shasta College. You've been out to the buildings. Do they inspire you much? Can you remember being in a classroom? Was it an incredible experience, or was it rather just another square room with no windows? Um, Other colleges are incredible. Shasta College is just, it's a community college. 4-year colleges are always a little bit more elaborate in their architecture because they want to reflect what's going on in the building, which is the gaining of knowledge through intellectual pursuits and learning. That's what we're doing here right now. And so the building usually represents somewhat what's going on inside the building. Think about a doctor's office. You're not pretty inspired about what goes on in the building itself because you don't like, nobody likes going to visit the office. Maybe the doctor, maybe you do, or a dentist. And so they have buildings that aren't exactly inspiring to put us, at ease with what's going to happen in the building. But during this Renaissance period that was flourishing in Florence, that was a concern and that was a consideration. It was important because what was going on in the building was important. And it says right now, I hope I'm recording still. It says my internet is unstable. Please, we'll see if this records. I'm not going to shut up, so I'll just keep going because it's done this before. Um, but as it goes on, uh, there was a form of architecture that came out in this era when Michelangelo was painting in Florence, and it originated in Florence. It's called Baroque architecture, and it's essentially, maybe you've heard that term. Um, there's music, Baroque music. There's that describes that music, and when it comes to architecture, what it usually means is kind of highly decorative. So it's fancy architecture. It's in very intense artistic expression of builders because they wanted to show uh, the importance of what's in the building by showing how important the building is itself. The building is important, and Baroque architecture reflects that. And so, if you ever get to go to old Europe, I hope you do get to travel again. Maybe you've been there already. Maybe you'd like to go to Europe. You will once we get the pandemic settled. You go to some of these old buildings, and you will be humbled by the beauty and the grace and the power that they instill in us when we see it. And they humble us. That's how important this Baroque architecture was, especially in places of worship, which was still very dominant in this Renaissance period. Even though Martin Luther was going up against the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church is going to do some reforms, meaning they're not going to be as quite as strict um, and brutal as they had been up until then. And people like Martin Luther King helped that along, that there's other ways to believe in something than instead of with a threat. Um, and so Baroque architecture and these usually was on display in these fantastic churches in Florence and other places in Europe also. So that's what's going on right now in the flourishing of this Renaissance, which is the period you're supposed to be reading about in the book. I signed the chapter. If you haven't got the book, I'll do my best to give you a thumbnail sketch of what the chapters are covering. Um, can you pass the course without the book? If you pay attention, yes. The book helps, the textbook, because you get to put the stuff in context. You get to read it at your own pace, and you'll get to see the photos and you get all that. But I'm going to provide visuals, documentaries, and stuff. I'll put them on Canvas and make those announcements. I put one on there today about Florence, the importance of Florence, and be pouring more on as our class goes on. Besides my lectures, there will be other documentaries to watch. So this is the virtual world we're living in. So we might as well see everything virtually. That's fine. I wish we could see this book virtually, but right now we're still having to order it the same old way and have it in our hands the old school way. But you can rent it, by the way, the book. Please, the second week now, and this is only a 6-week class, and so it will help if I know. Okay. Also, let's see what else do I have here. Um, the the Renaissance artists, they played the reason why they are different than the art up until that point. They put human concern and human feelings at the center of their creativity. Now, I know that sounds like, well, wouldn't they do that normally? Well, before then, most paintings were of a religious order, and they weren't putting our feelings and concerns at the center. They were putting the deities, God, or whomever they're painting, at the center. And we were there to serve. The Renaissance painters start painting humans, not God, us, the normal person, the average Joe. And that became the center of their art. And that was the first expression that put regular human beings at the center of the art and our concerns at the center. And this is at the center of their writings and their paintings and their sculptures. And it was the key. Is also intellectual curiosity in our search for meaning. Now, this is a time where a lot of people didn't know how to read, but the printing press is changing all of that because now we could print and in mass volumes. And the mass volumes of the print are allowing more and more access to regular people. Mostly people who learned how to read, knew how to read, were um, wealthy people, religious people, monks, affiliated with the church. Um, that's all changes with the printing press. And so when somebody like Cervantes comes around and writes a book, Don Quixote, he's not writing it for a few people, intellectuals, or the upper classes who knew how to read. He's writing it for the common man because more and more people knew how to read. And that changed everything once again. Once again, it's the flourishing of this this renaissance. So it's the shattering of the old world, the old order of things. And it's a way of looking at things with fresh eyes, with more, not from a godlike position, but here on the ground where we all live. The control by the Catholic Church was loosening its grip, not out of kindness but because people are demanding it. And then, in the midst of all this, in England, we have a writer, William Shakespeare, who is going to change, once again, everything there is to change up until that point. And we're still dealing with his language and his words 500 years later. There was other things happening in this area of Florence that radiated out to the rest of Europe. And there was philosophers, there was painters, there was politician philosophers like Machiavelli, who, if you read page 34, you'll be able to see some of that. He was considered a rather evil philosopher, and maybe you've heard that term, Machiavelli. It's never a good thing to be accused of that. It's usually something came from his teachings, how he conducted things when he was alive during this time of the Renaissance in Florence, Italy. That's how important Florence is to the story of this entire class, the humanistic condition, tradition. Um, Michelangelo, the writers, they're all pushing the envelope of idealism. And that's a scary thought to a lot of traditionalists of the time and classical. People held that classical uh, is the only tradition that you need to follow, strict. And so these painters and architects and writers were changing all of that. And in the classical structure and the traditional structures were losing their their death grip on humanity. And humanity now is going to flourish in a way it never had before through everything from art to people's health to the buildings they live in to the words they read to their dreams and to their hopes. Because now life was hopeful. They were pushing the envelope so there could be a quality of life, not just the drudgery of obeying the traditions. So the Renaissance was a revolution, and we're going to continue with that until I'm done with it. Next time I talk to you, we'll be talking about Shakespeare in more detail. With that, please watch this. I'll put it on the announcements and look at the documentary on I think it's under 15 minutes on Florence, the importance of Florence. Enjoy it, learn, read your chapters. Story of Humanities will continue next time.